Hello, and welcome to the 17th episode of A Woman Robbed, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is, where we talk about actresses who may have come close to earning Oscar nominations but were ultimately overlooked or omitted, or for one reason or another just didn't have the votes to make it into the final lineup, discussing why they may have deserved to get in and why they ultimately didn't. Each episode has its own theme, presented as a double feature, and this week we're going to be covering two performances from the 70s that didn't earn Oscar nominations. And my guest today has been on two Best Actress episodes before, discussing the 1956 Best Actress lineup and the 1999 lineup. So here she is kind of in the middle of those two decades. Talking the 70s. She is the host of the Female Gaze Film Club podcast. Welcome back to the show, Morgan Roberts.
Thank you so much for having me. I didn't realize that we were kind of aiming right in the middle of those two episodes that we've previously recorded. How lovely.
It is, yes. Well, let's get right into it. So I presented to my patrons here at And the Runner-Up Is a list of 15 of the most notable performances of the 70s that were not nominated, and the choices were, to recap, Karen Black in The Day of the Locust, Julie Christie in Don't Look Now, Shelley Duvall in Thieves Like Us, Ruth Gordon in Harold and Maude, Pam Grier in Coffee, Goldie Hawn in The Sugarland Express, Diane Keaton in Looking for Mr. Goodbar, Liza Minnelli in New York, New York, Vanessa Redgrave in The Devils, Gena Rowlands in Opening Night, Hannah Shaigula in The Marriage of Maria Braun, Sissy Spacek in Badlands, Liv Ullmann in Autumn Sonata, Joanne Woodward in The Effect of Gamma Rays on Man and the Moon Marigolds, and Susanna York in Images. And the top two vote getters were Ruth Gordon and Gena Rowlands, so no other choices really even came close to those two. But for transparency's sake, Diane Keaton in Looking for Mr. Goodbar came in third, with Julie Christie and Don't Look Now not too far behind, but they were very distant. These were the two very clear choices that the patrons wanted us to discuss this week. So, with that said, let's talk about just the 70s overall in film. Just curious from you, Morgan, what is your relationship to this decade in film and performances by actresses like the ones we'll be talking about today, and just any overall thoughts on this decade?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've slowly started to gravitate towards the 1970s as I've started to watch films kind of on my own. Like, I think obviously some of the big films like Jaws and Alien were stuff that were introduced to me when I was younger. But as I started watching films by and about women, I started to notice that the 70s had really great performances by women, i.e., look at the fact that you had so many performances for your patrons to choose from. And I feel like that's still even just the tip of the iceberg in regards to that decade. And so, yeah, it's been really interesting as I have started to look at film on my own that I have just naturally started to gravitate towards that decade and towards those performances.
One of us, yes. Yeah, the 70s are, I think, very deservedly kind of praised as a high watermark in film. I had a lot of fun diving into the 70s for the Best Actress series, especially because we saw so many actresses really given the opportunity to just show their stuff and go to very dark places, very vulnerable places, and, you know, kind of connect to something real and tangible and kind of unglamorous. So, you know, there is also just a real frankness, I think, to this decade, and is not afraid of an unhappy ending. And I love that, you know, this decade, I feel like, just very unafraid of making the audience uncomfortable at times. And I think you see that a little bit, too, in both of these performances, where there is some thorny territory we're getting into in the case of Harold and Maude. And for opening night, you have this character who is maybe not always the easiest to love, but you still have some sympathy for. And there's also an interesting sort of connection between the two of, you know, women who are facing older age, but in very, very different ways, obviously, and handling it in much almost the opposite way, you could say. So, you know, fascinating double feature that the patrons picked out, even if the two films may not seem super connected on the surface.
Yeah, it's such a great decade. And these performances, I mean, we'll talk more about it, but one of these performances is from one of my favorite films from this decade. So it really is such a showcase of women across generations because obviously I grew up watching primarily like 90s and early 2000s cinema, and we
Right.
basically assumed that women's lives stopped happening when they turned 30.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you had the opportunity to talk about my all-time favorite performance, Jill Clayburgh in An Unmarried Woman, which was nominated in 1978. And I just think it's so interesting the ways in which women really across, their age and where they are in their life cycle, we're really getting an opportunity to talk about their experiences. And yeah, I think that these performances that we're going to dive into are just so amazing and maybe sometimes on opposite spectrums of vibes, I guess, but there's
Yeah.
so much humanity in both of them that they're far more similar than dissimilar, I think.
Agreed. Yes, excited to explore both of those. So let's start in chronological order here with 1971 with Ruth Gordon in Harold and Maude.
I should like to change into a sunflower most of all. They're so tall and simple. What flower would you like to be?
I don't know. One of these, maybe?
Why do you say that?
Because they're all alike.
Oh, but they're not. Look, see, some are smaller, some are fatter, some grow to the left, some to the right. Some even have lost some petals, all kinds of observable differences. You see, Harold, I feel that much of the world's sorrow comes from people who are this, yet allow themselves to be treated as that.
Well, we never got to actually talk about Ruth Gordon on the Best Actress series, but she was a bit of an Academy darling. So by the time Harold and Maude came out, she had actually received 5 Oscar nominations, including a win in Best Supporting Actress for Rosemary's Baby in 1968. So, to introduce Miss Gordon,
Mhm.
she was born in Massachusetts in 1896, which is kind of mind-boggling, but yeah, she developed a love of performance at an early age, and she trained at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. She did a tiny bit of silent film work in the 1910s, but a lot of her early career was as a stage actress all the way through the 30s, and she broke into film in the 40s, mostly in supporting roles in films like Abe Lincoln in Illinois, Two-Faced Woman, but again, not really too much on screen. But then she sort of tried her hand at writing with her husband at the time, Garson Kanin, collaborating with him on films like A Double Life, Adam's Rib, and Pat and Mike. And the two of them scored Oscar nominations for all 3 of those films in the writing categories. And she continued her theater work. She got a Tony nomination for The Matchmaker. She continued writing until she finally came back to the screen after more than 20 years for Inside Daisy Clover in 1965, which got her first acting nomination in Supporting Actress. And then a few years later, she had Rosemary's Baby. She wins Best Supporting Actress. And I just wanted to note here, delivers one of my favorite lines ever in
Mhm.
an Oscar speech, where she says, "Thank you all for voting for me, and for all you didn't, please excuse me."
Iconic.
An incredible quote. And then a few years later, here she is in Harold and Maude in a rare leading role for her. So this is a romantic comedy, drama, coming of age type story written by Colin Higgins and directed by Hal Ashby. And it's about a young man named Harold, played by Bud Cort, who is obsessed with death and likes to stage fake suicides for his exhausted mother, who just wants him to be, her version of normal and marry a nice girl, basically. So, also part of Harold's obsession is attending funerals for people he doesn't know, and that's where he meets Maude, Ruth Gordon, a 79-year-old woman who has her own quirks, and they bond and form a friendship that turns into a relationship as Maude kind of imparts some life lessons to Harold about being a more active person in the world.
Mhm.
So, all that being said, let's get into Ruth Gordon here. Thoughts on Miss Gordon overall as an actress and her big performance here in Harold and Maude.
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of her on screen. So
Mm-hmm.
Harold and Maude is kind of like my point for her. I was watching this film rewatching it, just going like, wow, she has like a twinkle in her eye the entire time that is just so mesmerizing and moving and incredible. And it makes sense that she was on stage for as long as she was, because I think that stage actors, especially at that time when we're starting to see people ebb and flow between stage and screen a little bit more, rather than trying to like squarely be a film actor and squarely be a stage actor. I think that she brought just such great warmth and humanity to this character. And I mean, it's a dark comedy. It starts off with this young boy who is frequently staging just more and more graphic and intense fake suicides. And when she comes in, she just breathes life into this film, which was already very captivating from the start. But I don't think that you realize kind of like where the tone had set you from the very beginning until she comes into the film and really starts to change things. I think that that's such a powerful way as a performer to literally your presence absolutely alters everything about a film or a piece. And I think that she does that so incredibly here.
Yeah. And so, I mean, like, I first got to know Ruth Gordon, as a lot of people do probably nowadays, through her work in Rosemary's Baby, where I think she is just the perfect menace and just one of the prime examples of why we should reward supporting performances, because that is actually another film where her presence, when she walks in and she has a much smaller presence, totally changes the temperature of what's happening. And, I've also seen her other nomination for Inside Daisy Clover, which is a very, very small performance, but certainly very effective. She just does have that incredible lived-in presence, I think, on screen. But yeah, Harold and Maude is definitely a special one, and it's a film that resonated with me when I watched it however many years ago, as someone who felt like an outcast, and also seeing this sort of unconventional relationship form. It really, really stuck with me. And Ruth's presence here is so fun to watch. She's just so cool, which I love. She just feels so authentic as this person, as someone you would meet in real life and just want to know everything about them and never get tired of all of their life stories. And just like, they may talk your ear off, but also like by the end of it, you would die for them. Like, that's, you know what I mean?
Totally. And there's a charm to her that it's like, if she wasn't charismatic, if she wasn't compassionate, then you wouldn't kind of excuse some of her eccentricities that sometimes border on unsafety.
Yeah.
And I think you have to be such a skilled actor to be able to allow someone's complexities to exist without you trying to defend them. Because I think, especially in film nowadays, we really like to make sure that if someone is complicated, that we give some kind of excuse to allow that complication to exist. And she's just a person. And she really allows Maude to be just complex and messy and joyously wonderful in every sense of the phrase.
Yeah, definitely. And I was even, looking at other actors who could have played this role that Hal Ashby was looking at, like Peggy Ashcroft and Gladys Cooper, Celia Johnson, Louise Reiner. And, I like a lot of those actresses, but I don't know if any of them would have necessarily had this kind of wit to them and spunk that this role really needs. I also think it is one where it's one of those characters that on the page could be kind of two-dimensional and just kind of serve as like an extension of Harold and his journey, which is kind of how the film is a little bit set up at times. But I think she just breathes so much life into it that you kind of forget that it's sort of supposed to be Harold's story here, because she just completely steals the show and you can't even like see anyone else when she's on screen,
Yeah. I think one of the things too about it is she's playing this character who is an older adult. She meets this young man. And I think that even today, there's kind of, we really struggle with aging in general, but especially seeing people who are aging as both a time capsule for the life that they've lived, as well as a being that is continuing to live. We obviously
Mm.
see the former, but the latter is so much more difficult. And I think that while Harold is kind of like our main character and who we see the world through, I think she does such a great job of kind of breaking down those barriers for Harold to like truly see her as a person and
Yeah.
really fall in love with all of these qualities about her that just make her so endearing.
I agree. And I think, this could have been a very proto version of the manic pixie dream girl, almost, as odd as that is to say about this kind of thing, because she's like so spunky and full of life, and she's so adventurous and has a little bit of a manic energy to her, you could say, because she's so quirky and fun. But there are these little looks, and I think Hal Ashby also deserves some credit for letting us linger on her face when things take a little bit of a more serious turn and she starts to think about her life or looks back on, certain really tough experiences that she had in the past. And kind of it does round out the character in a nice way without even her having to say anything, really.
Yeah, and I think Hal Ashby does such a great job with giving Ruth Gordon so much space. Because I think that he did it with Budcourt earlier in the film, where again, like we kind of see Harold in his really dour, sad, super depressed era. And I mean, but there's still really quick cuts between Harold and his mother, and there's not a whole lot of lingering. And then I think as Maude kind of gets introduced and thrown into the mix, we kind of like take a beat and really stay with her, kind of in a way of like allowing the audience to be the same as Harold, to just really be so focused on who she is and her stories. And I mean, there are just the way in which she would sometimes pose a question as both absolutely sincere, and also you could tell that there's a little mischievousness behind why she's poking and prodding. It really is just so lovely. And we would just like linger. Like she would ask the question, and I think the natural instinct would be to cut to Harold or whomever is being asked that question to get their initial reaction. And we just stay on her to kind of see her own anticipation of what she's going to hear.
And that is what makes it ultimately feel more equal in that way. And I do think, a lot of films these days could take some lessons from
For sure.
that, just saying. But just to talk to like their first meeting, which I love, where they're at the mass for neither of them know who the person being buried is. But I love the kind of mischievous looks as she's pestering him with her commentary about like all the odd sort of ceremonial stuff we do with death and funerals, like the black flowers and everything. But she also talks about how 80 is a good age to die, and like 75 is too soon, 85 you're just sort of biding your time. And she just seems to have everything all figured out in a way. And he is visibly annoyed, I think, at first, because he's just kind of an antisocial person. But they do have this shared sort of creativity, I think, and a critical thinking, and just a lightness within talking about dark subject matter. So even though they are different for many reasons, there is this sort of unspoken sense there of like these outcasts who are being drawn to each other in a way that neither of them can really vocalize why, but like it just makes sense. And I think it's actually really sweet ultimately.
Yeah, and I'm so struck by the ways in which they're both finding themselves at this mass for a person they have no idea who is even being buried. And, Harold is so obsessed with death because he's so afraid of life. And I feel like Maude is looking at death to kind of plan her next journey. Like she kind of is like Peter Pan in that death is the next great adventure. And it's so interesting when they meet because she is very playful with it. And he takes it's so funny because he's acting so serious when literally he's kind of making a mockery of death in, when he's around his own mother. But when someone who is kind of so playful and joyful about like, yeah, we're all gonna die, but I hope it's at 80 because it's so much cleaner. And isn't it so weird that we do all of these things at our funerals? And it's just so fascinating to kind of see that they both have the same interest and yet approach it from such different angles. And when he just kind of is like so captivated by her, I too would also, if I met someone like that at a funeral, I would just want to follow them around.
Yeah.
And also apparently to make sure that they don't steal your car, because
That too. Yes.
that's part of her journey as well.
I do love that running gag as well. And I love also the scene where he enters her place, I think for the first time, where she's just like posing fully nude for this artist. And she shows off all her little projects she's working on, like this sort of wild invention that makes you smell these very highly specific things like snowfall and like 42nd Street and all these things. And she has all these sculptures she likes to sort of feel, and it's all a lot of very primal sort of sensory things that are full of life and character.
Yeah.
And that is what makes the sort of the dichotomy of her knowing she'll be ending her life soon so effective and fascinating, because it is ultimately actually a very healthy way of looking at the world and ending it on her own terms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's always so interesting too that she really is trying to like find what makes Harold tick. Because there's that scene where he takes her to like there's a construction zone and they're doing some demolition of a building, and like he enjoys watching that. And it's so interesting because what makes her tick is like creation, and his is so much about like destruction and finality, and hers is there's like theories about how life and death aren't necessarily polar opposites, but working in tandem together at all times, that creation and destruction are supposed to be friends and not enemies. And I find it so interesting that we certainly get that with the two of them. And it also kind of subverts the expectation that someone who's nearing their life is actually so invested in living, where someone who is at the very start of his own feels so immersed in the finality of death. And I really love that we get to kind of see these themes run parallel with each other. And again, if you don't have someone like Ruth Gordon in this role as Maude, like how do you feel any sense of joy when there is this very dark undercurrent running at the same time?
Thank you for listening to this preview of A Woman Robbed, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please go to patreon.com/andtherunnerup is and become a patron. Only $3 a month will get you access to bonus episodes and early access to regular episodes. Thank you so much for your consideration.